Welcome back to Honda Garage, Idaho. In today's video, we're looking at part 3 of my audio upgrade in this 2011 CRZ, the subwoofer system. Now, I'm doing a completely custom box, super concealed mount and everything, a fully custom setup that is specific to my vehicle that doesn't have a hybrid battery in it. However, I'm going to try and share some information in this video that should help you set up any type of subwoofer you're looking to install in your CRZ. Let's get started. Now my CRZ is case-swapped, which means I took the hybrid battery out and have all this space sitting underneath the spare tire area in my truck just doing nothing. As you can see, I've already run some sound insulation through here, got my pass-through plate for the hybrid wiring blocked off, but what I want to do is build a custom sub box to fit in the trunk here, take up just exactly this amount of space, and mount the speaker there, run all the wiring underneath the paneling so it's 100% out of sight, but it still sounds great. So my first step is actually going to be to 3D scan the trunk here so I can design a box that will fit exactly in this area. So I want to start designing my custom sub box, and I just real quickly threw the 3D scan in here into FreeCAD. And what I've got is just a very simple, very crude mock-up of what I think the sub box will look like, or about the space it can take up. This small box here is my amplifier. So what I ended up doing was wondering, well, is this size of box going to be compatible with the subwoofer that I already purchased? Because the internal box volume, especially if it's sealed, does play a big part in the sound. So I ran a calculation, and the volume internally of this big blocky solid that I just quickly generated here is about 59.5 million cubic millimeters. If we throw that in Google, that gives us just over 2 cubic feet, and wouldn't you know it, the spec for the max sealed box volume on this particular sub is 2 cubic feet. And of course, this is just the outside dimensions of the box, so once it's built with the MDF, the inner actual volume is going to be quite a bit smaller. But we can see I have a range of 2 cubic feet at the largest and 1.25 cubic feet at the smallest, so plenty of room to work. I think that for the sub I picked, this type of box is going to be the perfect setup. Okay, so with the 3D model dialed in, I made some rudimentary dimensional drawings. I'm going to haul this MDF that I picked up to my dad's place. He's going to help me get this cut out, and then we can start assembling the box. Now, as I've said a couple times in the past, I'm by no means a car audio expert, and I'm also not a professional woodworker. In fact, this is the first subwoofer box I've ever designed and built myself. I've owned others that came in prefab boxes, but anyway, my dad was kind enough to let me come down and borrow his tools for the afternoon to cut out these panels, and I'm loosely following a guide I found online from Crutchfield on designing and building your own box, so that's where I picked up the thickness for the MDF I'm using and so on. I did cut some of these little triangle pieces for the interior to act as supports, some bracing to give the box some more strength because the speaker is quite heavy. And I'm just going to go through and assemble everything here, cutting out a few holes, of course, for the subwoofer itself, as well as the wire pass-through. And I'm going to have the amp mounted on the side. I'm also going to run some waterproof silicone all around inside the box across the seams just to help with the air tightness, hopefully seal it up a bit better in case I didn't glue any joints quite perfectly. Once the physical box was done, it was time to wrap it up with some nice felt to give it a clean finished look, as well as add the pass-through for the wiring, install the amp, and of course, the final keystone of the build, the actual sub. Well, the sub box turned out pretty amazing, at least for a first-time project, I think. It looks awesome, it's pretty sturdy, and it's also extremely heavy, so I'm now going to put it in my car as quickly as possible. Okay, it's in there. Almost a perfect fit, including the space here for the amplifier. It looks awesome. Now here's something I did notice beforehand while designing the box. The box, of course, is rectangular, quite square, sharp corners, but the cutout in the vehicle is quite rounded. There's a lot of slightly curved surfaces, nothing's perfectly square. So this box is actually mostly resting on its corners here, down at the bottom. There's little gaps around the sides and underneath, in fact. So after doing next to no research online, I came across one person who said they used carpet to pad their secret sub box, and that's what I ended up doing. I discovered this roll offcut from a job at a local carpet warehouse, picked that up for a few bucks. So we're going to cut some small pieces to lay under and around the sub box, make sure it's got a lot more contact area, and hopefully prevent a bit of excess noise and vibration from the box rattling directly against the chassis. Okay, while background me works on that, let's take a look at the wiring. I'm going to show you specifically what I do for my wiring setup, but I'm also going to give you some general pointers on how you might hook up any subwoofer you plan to install. Now, for any good aftermarket subwoofer setup, you're going to need a lot of power, and there's a couple critical things to keep in mind when you're wiring the power for your subsystem. The first thing to keep an eye out for is the gauge of your wire. That's the thickness of the actual metal inside of this wire. The thicker your wire, the more power it can handle, and that is crucial to keep in mind because the higher power amperage system you're running for your subwoofer and amp, the more power is going to get squeezed through this wire, and if you have too small, it will heat up and potentially cause damage, blow a fuse, even start a fire. So you can use online calculators such as this one to determine what thickness of wire you're going to need for your amplifier system. Many amplifiers that come with instruction manuals may even say which gauge wire they recommend, so research that first. The other and arguably more important section of your power wire is the fuse. This needs to be very close to your battery. So I've got this here that's going to tee off my positive battery post, and just a few inches away is my fuse. Again, look at the instructions for the system you're setting up to see what fuse is recommended. Make sure you get something that has that. In fact, there's quite common amp kits out there that include ground wire, power wires, fuse blocks, and more. As I've said many times throughout this series, make sure you're looking at stuff like Crutchfield, great resources for what types of parts you're going to need, where you can get them at good prices, and making sure everything matches up so your system functions well and is safe. Now this power wire I'm actually going to be reusing. This was left in the vehicle by the previous owner. I did check that it is capable of running the system I'm going to put in, and we're going to need to route it through the engine bay. Hopefully I have enough length to make it back to my amplifier. If not, I'll go ahead and pick up a longer uncut section of wire to use. But we're going to route that from the battery terminal down the side here. Coming back here behind the air conditioning lines, we can see a rubber gasket down here in front of the passenger seat. Plenty of space in front of it to work with. Don't mind that light shining through. My wheel well fender liner is missing. So we're going to cut a small slot in there and feed the wire in through and underneath the dash. Now we do want our positive battery terminal completely disconnected for this part of the project, but we're still not even going to attach our positive cable yet. I don't want there to be any risk of the open end of this wire shorting out on the frame or anything as we pass it through. So we're just going to use this as a guide for how much slack we need to leave to reach the battery and start tying the rest of this back along the engine bay. Now I have chosen to route my cable back here along behind the engine and the engine bay. You may choose, of course, to go from the battery across the front and along the side. Whatever routing you pick, as long as you have enough wire, it should be fine. The main thing you'll want to avoid is contacting anything that gets hot. So these heater hoses, for example, your exhaust, obviously, brake lines, maybe stray away from those. And if your wiring is going to get close to it, add some protective loom around it just to give it an extra layer of heat resistance. Either way, once you feed the wire far enough back here, we're going to get to this grommet that's in front of the passenger footwell. And using a screwdriver or a knife, we're just going to poke a small hole. We don't need to cut a hole big enough for the wire, just a small slit will do. Since this is a nice flexible rubber grommet, the wire will make its own space through there as we push it in. And during this part, it's helpful to have two people, one to feed the wire in and one to look for it under the glove box and pull it the rest of the way through. So to see where that power wire comes through, we're going to get in here under the dash and take out this plastic under tray first. Using our hands, we can pull down to release these metal clips here. We're also going to want to disconnect our OEM footwell light so we can take this plastic completely out. Okay, so down below our glove box, we have here the blower motor for our heater system. If we look over toward the passenger door underneath here, we can see there's an opening. And looking up into this opening or feeling with our hand, that right there is the rubber grommet that wire is going to be passing through. All right, there it is, our wire passing through from under the dash. And while we're here, let's take a quick pit stop to meet the other wires that are joining us from the dashboard before we continue running down the side. Now, with essentially any aftermarket amplifier and subwoofer system, there's three main things your amplifier is going to need. Power, which is what this big wire is for. We're already pulling it back there. That's great. We're also going to need a set of audio cables to actually take the sound signal to the subwoofer. That's the sound that's going to play from the speaker. And finally, we need a remote trigger wire. This is just going to be a small, low-voltage wire that sends a light signal to the amplifier to tell it, hey, turn on, start pulling juice. You don't want it always on, draining your battery constantly. So your stereo will have an output wire for this amp, and that's what will tell it to turn on and start putting audio through the sub. There is also a ground wire. Obviously, it's going to be about the same size as our power wire, but that's going to get attached to the chassis right next to the amp itself. And you're also probably going to have a remote control for volume level. I'll cover that in a little bit. Are you finished yet? No, not even close. So your amplifier and by extension your subwoofer requires those three things to function. But now the question is, well, where do you get them? And that's where a lot of the nuance comes in depending on your setup and what other hardware you're using in your vehicle. And that is where this vaguely tic-tac-toe-like game comes in as a visual aid to help explain the stuff that I was already going to say out loud in this video. Now in the previous video, part 2, doing the stereo installation, I covered a little bit of info on determining whether or not you have a factory amplifier, and that basically comes down to whether you have a factory subwoofer. If your vehicle does not come with any kind of preparation for a subwoofer, here's what you need to know. The trigger wire is basically just any 12-volt signal going to the amp to tell it to turn on, and where we're going to pull that from is our stereo harness with all of our speaker wires. Showing on this diagram here, this pin is our accessory 12-volt power wire, which is essentially only powered when the ignition's on. So we're going to tap off of that, solder on a pigtail, whatever you need to do to pull a signal out of that, and that's what we're going to feed to our amplifier as our trigger. As for the audio signal to send to your amplifier, this needs to be pulled from one pair of speaker wires going to one of the other speakers in your vehicle. Now there's various products that can do this. In fact, there's even plug-and-play harnesses that go in between your stereo and automatically pull out a composite audio jack and remote trigger wire. I've seen mixed reviews on these things, so use at your own risk. But there are quite a few products out there that make it possible to pull a audio signal from your speaker wires and add a circuit to send that to an amplifier for a sub output as well. Do a little bit of research once you pick one. Definitely make sure to read through the instructions and follow them while you're doing the installation and wiring to make sure you get the best results. That type of installation applies whether you're using your factory stereo or an aftermarket stereo and you just don't have an amp for either one. Next up on our board, we have the why are you even here option. That would be putting in an upgraded subwoofer while retaining whatever stereo you have and reusing the factory amp. This, in my opinion, is probably going to be the worst value upgrade you could possibly go for because you're still going to be heavily limited by the amplifier power of the stock CRZ amp, regardless of what kind of stereo you have. It is somewhat of a simple job wiring-wise because the amplifier takes care of it and sends an audio signal down to this plug in your trunk. If you had a factory sub, you can just go ahead and use this connector to make a pigtail and send that to your new subwoofer box, whether it's something in its own separate box or something you happen to find that's a close enough size to mount in the factory bracket behind the grill. Either way, that's a lot of work and you're probably not going to see much benefit to it, so I don't recommend doing that. So what we end up with here is that these are all actually one kind of giant box. If you're using your factory stereo in any case, whether you have no original factory amplifier and sub or you do have one, you're probably going to want to bypass it with those products I described earlier, pulling a fresh sound signal out of one of your speaker wires, getting a simple trigger signal from an accessory ignition wire, and running those back to your amplifier along with our big battery wire, and just using that to power your sub. The last specific option up here, which is an aftermarket stereo and an aftermarket amp sub, is what I'm going with. I won! Now essentially every aftermarket stereo you're going to find that has extra outputs besides factory speakers has a dedicated subwoofer output and a wire specifically for the amplifier remote switch function. So we're going to use that on my aftermarket stereo. That's exactly what we're going to go locate now and start running to meet our power wire in the vehicle. Okay, so regardless of your source, now back here you should have an audio cable and a remote trigger wire. You can feed the ends of those down here behind the stereo, right next to our little USB module there, and we'll start running those and tying them along the bottom of the dash. Your amplifier will probably take a left and right input. If your stereo only has one output, there's any number of cheap splitters and stuff like this you can get online. There is one other cable that you may need to run back here, and that's the remote volume control that I mentioned earlier. Now, most aftermarket amplifiers I've seen come with this type of little gain knob. It's basically just a remote volume control, so if you want to turn your sub down from max power without actually going to the trunk, you can. And that's something that you would typically mount, you know, somewhere in your center console or underneath your dash for easy access. If you do that, you'll have one more wire to run back here and follow along with the rest of our cables as we go to the amplifier. I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. I discarded the one that came with my amplifier. I'm going to use this aftermarket one I picked up from Amazon, which gives me a couple extra features like pushing to completely switch the amp on and off, as well as a voltage meter so I can see what my current voltage is. Kind of a gimmick, but I'd like to have it. So I'm going to mount that in first and get my wiring done up for that. Let's take a look. Okay, so for the aftermarket volume knob, power button, and display that I picked out, I'm going to mount it down under this surface where the USB compartment is hidden. And so to do that, I've pulled apart some of the factory trim and stuff here, my shift boot. Take a look at the video linked in the description for a guide on how to disassemble that stuff if you need it. But once that's all done, we can take a few screws out on top here and pop this whole compartment off, so I can now cut out spots for my wire pass-through and mounting that little controller. Pulling my factory USB cable out of here, we can spin this around and see that there's some Phillips head screws holding this compartment onto this trim. We got 2 right here and of course 2 on the other side. So let's remove that, and then the USB compartment can pop out the front. With those screws out, we can just push down a couple of these little clips by hand. And out comes this little section separate from the console. The plug back here on the cigarette lighter / charging port can be quite a pain to remove. These spade terminals are on super tight. So I'm going to leave that attached for now and go ahead and just start getting ready to mount my controller on the underside of this plastic. Okay, there it is, a couple well-placed screws and we're there. As far as the wiring on this remote goes, it doesn't have a separate line to the amp. It actually controls the volume in through the RCA stuff. So it's got 2 composite in, 2 composite out, and then a bunch of bare wires here. Positive and ground for the voltmeter, and then a input and output for the remote trigger pass-through. I put my own connectors on those just to keep things easily reversible, as you know I love to do. But now we can go ahead and get those hooked up and finally put our front end back together on the dash and start routing the wires the rest of the way back. Quick minute just to appreciate how clean this looks all put together with that little controller. Okay, so now we've finally got all our wiring brought down from the stereo, run it along here kind of as I showed in the previous video, and now we can take our power cable, remote trigger, audio wire, and your volume control wire if there's a separate one, and we're going to start running them back here. You can, of course, just leave them laying right here on the floor. I'm not that kind of guy. What we're going to do is pull the trim up off the whole side of this door here and run our wires underneath the panel so they're super discreet all the way back. We're going to start by peeling up the rubber weather stripping along the door. This just pulls up and off the metal frame. We'll go ahead and take that off all the way around just to get it out of our way. Now, while I am a fan of doing things right, there are sometimes some corners you can cut. For example, we don't actually have to pull this trim off. All we have to do is push it away from the side of the car far enough to slide the wires in between this plastic here. Starting up at the top floor of this kick panel here, we got to feed our wires in from right here. This is underneath the passenger footwell, so we can bring them right in the side here and then down. Now we can pry this panel away from the vehicle and push our wires one at a time through these small gaps in the plastic. Now, if your wires, especially the 12-volt power wire, are too thick to get in this gap, just being able to bend it out, you can pull upward on this panel, and same with this, to pop some of the plastic push pins out of the door frame here. So if you just pull up, that will give you quite a bit more lenience on fitting those wires in. Now, once we get back here toward the back of the door frame, that's where things get a bit trickier. If you don't want to physically remove the trim, this entire trim within the vehicle comes off in essentially one piece. So if you're not keen to remove that, then the grabber tool will once again be your friend. If we travel up the door frame a bit, you can see this small outline of a panel here. Right at the base of it, there is a plastic clip in here that we can pop out to give ourselves some more flexibility without removing the whole panel. So here's my routing so far. You can see we kind of come up here and just on the inside of this plastic right next to the factory harness. One other thing that can help you get the wires back there is to have basically a feeder. So starting off with something not even necessarily a wire, but just something that's rigid that you can insert through here. all the way through till you can reach it coming out of the other end of the gap here. And then tape your wiring to that and pull it the rest of the way through, and your wires come along for free. Now in my vehicle, my hybrid system is removed, so I don't have the fan system and ducting right here. That will make it more difficult for you. Now if you're still finding it difficult to feed the wiring all the way back here, but you don't want to remove the whole side, with this quote-unquote seat lifted up, you can pull out this plastic tray on the bottom. It's just held in with a few plastic clips on the front and a few on the back on top of the metal back there. But you can lift this up and take it all the way out, and that will get you a lot better access to the bottom edge of this trim piece, where you can kind of pull your wires along from there. So with that bottom tray removed, you can see that inside here, that gives us super quick access to the bottom there. Now, like I said, my sub is getting mounted underneath the trunk, so if yours is going to be sitting on top of like the spare tire cover, you're going to want to think about where your wires are going to come up out of the floor to meet your sub. One of the gaps in between the panels is good, so you don't have to drill an extra hole, but just play around with it. It'll depend a lot on the size and shape of the sub and where you're going to keep it in the trunk. Anyway, once you finally get all your wiring back, it's time to hook it up to the amp. So we've got positive, ground, and trigger. Obviously, most amps will be the same. Just use whatever installation hardware is required. For the ground wire, as I said earlier, you're going to want it to be the same gauge as your power wire, and you're going to want to route it to somewhere on the chassis as close to the amp as possible with a clean metal contact point. I'm going to be using this spot where the hybrid battery bracket used to bolt up. I'm going to have to use a nut as a spacer. If you wanted to just bolt yours right on top of that, that should work fine. As long as there's good metal contact, you're good to go. Okay, so here's what my final setup looks like. We've got ground right there, positive and signals coming in. Everything turned out pretty clean, so now it's time to go plug the fuse and the positive battery terminal in, and I guess fire it up and see how it sounds. Don't forget to re-secure your trim and throw the weather stripping back on when you're done. If you're having trouble getting any output out of your sub, there's a few quick things to check. First up, of course, use a multimeter and make sure that your main power wire to the amplifier is actually getting good power right at the end. Also, for your ground wire, make sure that wherever it's bolted that there's no paint on the surface. Make sure you give it a nice clean and it's bare metal that you can see. The most likely culprit's going to be your remote wire. Make sure that your stereo is actually using it, that you have the right one selected. And if you put any hardware in between, like a switch like I did here, make sure that that's not interfering with it, that it's working properly and wired correctly, so you're actually sending 12 volts on the remote line as well. Also, if you're not getting any sound, make sure you check the settings on whatever stereo you're using. Some of them might require you to enable the subwoofer output. For example, mine required me not only to go to my sound settings to turn my external amplifier trigger on, then I also had to go to my equalizer and go find this subwoofer setting and turn the actual volume of it up as well. So double check for anything like that in the manual for your stereo if you're having trouble getting audio output. It also doesn't hurt to go through the manual for whatever amp and sub you bought, especially the amp. There's a lot of settings on a lot of them that can be fine-tuned with your gain, your level, your frequency passes, all that stuff. And if they're set wrong, you may just not get any output out of the sub at all. So go ahead and just go over that with a fine-tooth comb, make sure everything is set up correctly before you start trying to boost it super loud, just to make sure your speaker's working. Okay, well I think that's about where I'm going to leave it as far as the sub goes. I don't plan on giving much instruction on tuning your sub or, adjusting the gain and everything. Everyone's personal preference for how it sounds is going to be different, so just play around with it, read your instructions, figure out what sounds good to you and in your vehicle. From now, mine is set up, it's working great, and I'm super excited to hear how it sounds. Okay, I don't know what background we ended up doing, but I went ahead and just cut some pieces of carpet myself and threw them in here. This one's tucked all the way underneath the corner on that side. There's one strip in the middle and then just a couple of small pieces here. So it's balanced, it's contacting in a lot more spots, and it's not going to rattle against the frame. I don't know that it really would have, but I figured I'll try this out. And just for fun, here is how it looks with some more of the trunk trim reinstalled, as well as the spare tire foam. Not sure if I'm going to be able to use a spare tire in here. I'm thinking about doing some custom bracing or something and making a mount that will retain it. But obviously I don't want to risk anything hitting the speaker itself, so we'll see what happens there. But for now, this is how I'm going to run it. One more thing real quick. In the first video of this series, I said I was going to use the different cargo cover out of a CRZ that didn't have a factory sub in it, and that the GE Fit one is the same. That is not true. The one I picked up from a junkyard was from a GE Fit, but I was actually taking it out of a CRZ. Someone swapped them. So that actually doesn't work. The shaping back here is a bit different, and the clips where they snap into the plastic up top are in different spots. So you do need a CRZ specific one if you're deleting a factory sub doing something like this. I'm going to keep using my OEM one for now until I can find the correct one for the vehicle, but just thought I'd throw that out there. Okay, well that about wraps it up for this video. So this was part 3 of my audio upgrade in this Honda CR-Z. I hope you enjoyed the video and that the information I presented was somewhat helpful. If you're planning to put a sub in your own vehicle, hopefully this gave you a good idea of what will be necessary to get it done. And let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed or you have questions on. I'll try to help out. Until next time, thank you so much for watching.